Today is the 22nd of July, 2014. My guest is Bill Salyer, teacher at Meigs County, raised in Athens County, where he got his high school diploma, and then went on to Ohio University to learn some teaching credentials. I am Robert Whaley, professor of history, retired from Ohio University. And this is the Athens Speakout, number 316. Now, Bill Salyer and I used to have some discussions about a year ago, so we want to do a little bit of a review of where we left off. But we spoke about the first four presidents of the United States: George Washington from Virginia, John Adams, second president from Massachusetts, and third president, Thomas Jefferson, also from Virginia, and then James Madison from Virginia, the fourth president. And we kind of stopped off in the middle of the Madison administration, so we want to kind of review that. But we first want to review something about Washington and Adams. And in the first president, 1789, when the Constitution was ratified, Virginia was the most populous state and the most advanced state, and about 90% of the population were engaged in farming in Virginia and throughout the United States. And today that has been reduced to 1 or 2% in actual grassroots farming. But if you want to add the business, the agribusiness, maybe 10% of the population is engaged in some kind of mixed business farming. Anyway, George Washington was unique in history, for he won the American Revolutionary War, and the great slogan of Washington was, "First in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen." And that was a slogan invented in the 1800s after Washington died. And I regard him as the number one and greatest president, although most historians think that the greatest president was my second favorite, Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of the United States. But we'll maybe someday get into that discussion. But I regard George Washington as number one. He only served he did serve 2 terms, but they were a little bit shortened, from 1790 to 1796. And the reason for this shortening was that the Constitution was drafted in 1787 and ratified in 1789, so that the Congress met before Washington was inaugurated in a unique place, namely New York City. And the Congress met in Philadelphia, so it took a little time to organize the first administration. The Bill of Rights were ratified in 1789, and they finally got off the ground in 1790 with a coordinated administration. Now, Article 1 of the Constitution set the rules for Congress, and Congress has the duty to make the laws, and Article 2 established the powers and the rights of the president, and the president is supposed to enforce the laws of Congress. And George Washington was personally only wanting to serve 1 term. But because the 13 states were still so divided in their interests and their ambitions, and they had not yet really began to think of the United States as one nation, Washington decided to go for a 2nd term, because there was a deep division between the northern states and the southern states, and a deep division between the merchants and the farmers. And George Washington faced a global war between England and France coming out of the French Revolution of 1789. And an international war broke out in 1792 in which all of Europe were kind of united against revolutionary France. And that spilled over into North America and South American waters because of the interests of the French Empire and the British Empire. So Napoleon had global ambitions without limit. In that respect, he was something like Adolf Hitler, and he was somewhat parallel to Alexander the Great of ancient Greece, who, all three cases, knew no limits until they were defeated by some greater force. Napoleon then attacked the Austrian Empire with its capital in Vienna. He attacked the King of Prussia with his capital in Berlin. And he went on to attack Russia and the Emperor of Russia in its capital in St. Petersburg. He had invaded Italy, he invaded Denmark and Switzerland and the Netherlands and Spain. And it took a long time to finally arrest Napoleon and put him in prison for a lifetime sentence. He even went to Rome, and he had Pope Pius VI crown him as the Emperor of the West in 1806. Philosophically, he was a deist. He had very little faith in the Roman Catholic religion, but he needed that extra prestige which came from that crowning as emperor by Pope Pius VI, because the majority of the population in Europe probably still believed in the Catholic religion. Well, when Napoleon was defeated in 1815, he had to serve a lifetime sentence on the island of St. Helena, and he was the first war criminal prosecuted for war crimes. So the greatness of George Washington is that he preserved the peace, and he resisted calls on the part of some uninformed people for getting involved in war. And he told his citizens that they should not make him a king, and that they should keep a decentralized government in which the 13 states and the governors would be the future of the United States. Washington appointed the best Secretary of Treasury of all time, Alexander Hamilton from New York, a merchant, who balanced the federal budget and set a precedent for most of the secretaries of treasury up until the present time. Well, maybe beginning with Johnson and Nixon. We've been going downhill on that, but we have a deep debt now that seems to have no solution. Alexander Hamilton may have had some secret imperial ambitions, and he was a great rival of Aaron Burr, who was also a New Yorker. And Jefferson made Burr the vice president, and Burr and Hamilton had a duel in which Hamilton lost, and maybe the country was better off that he died in 1801 when his reputation was still intact. Burr went on to have a tragic end. Anyway, Hamilton created the first conservative party in America, called the Federalists, and Hamilton was very important in drafting the Constitution. He was one of 55 members, and he played a great role in putting in the various articles and writing the Federalist Papers and convincing the other 55 delegates to vote for this strong Constitution from the point of view of the federal government, and that's why he called himself a Federalist. The second great party was created by his rival, Thomas Jefferson from Virginia, who created the Democratic Republican Party, which was dedicated to states' rights. And the Virginia delegation pushed for the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, which guaranteed the liberties of the individuals, guaranteed freedom of the speech, freedom of press, free exercise of religion, and the right of the citizens to petition their government for various grievances and the freedom of assembly. The Fourth and Fifth Amendments guaranteed trial by jury and no cruel and unusual punishments, and that was all inherited from the common law of England, which had evolved from 1100 down to 1776, so that many of the features of the English law were incorporated by the 13 states in their state constitutions and in the Federal Republic. As I say, Thomas Jefferson was a champion of states' rights, and the Democratic Republican Party were supporting the rights of the poor farmers, the small merchants, those people who were in debt to the big banks. And Jefferson was the first Secretary of State to serve George Washington very successfully. And Jefferson established how to administer the diplomatic service in the State Department. And he established the rules for recognition of revolutionary states and new states. And Jefferson's rule was, makes no difference whether the government is a monarchy or whether it's a conservative Republican or radical Republican or dictatorship or Catholic or Protestant or secular or even Muslim. You should recognize a government which has a stable, settled government and has a territory and has at least the passive consent of the people, and that government should have an ambassador or minister sent to it as an envoy to establish regular diplomatic relations to preserve the peace. So George Washington followed Jefferson's State Department, and in his farewell address of 1796, Washington reminded his citizens, don't have passionate attachments to any foreign country, and avoid entangling alliances. And if you're going to have an alliance, make it a bilateral alliance, a bilateral contract with mutual interests protected by both sides, so that it's to their interest of both sides to enforce equal treaties. And what an entangling alliance was some kind of an unequal alliance in which one great power can entangle the weaker party into subjection. And the Constitution says that all treaties should be ratified by 2/3 of the Senate, and that Washington recommended free trade with all powers and preserve international law, which was called the law of nations in the Constitution, as equal to the Constitution in its authority. So the American people were lucky since 1796 and didn't elect any really bad presidents until the 20th and 21st century. Recent presidents have been tempted by the idea of imperialism and dictatorship and are expanding wars into foreign territory with no end in sight. So to be an empire, you have to have a police state to enforce this. And imperial presidents intervene in the civil wars of underdeveloped states and weak states and try to create a protectorate or satellite state. Okay, I think I finished that review, and I'm going to ask the first question of Bill Salyer. What are the accomplishments of John Adams, the second president?
He appointed Marshall, didn't he?
What's that?
Did he appoint Marshall?
That's true. That
Supreme
is
Court?
probably his greatest achievement. John Marshall was appointed in 1801, just as Jefferson was retiring. And John Marshall was a conservative from Virginia who checked the powers of the Jeffersonian Democrats and gave the Supreme Court power to declare, well, it was under John Marshall's interpretation. The Constitution just said that the Supreme Court should have the power to settle disputes between states and settle disputes in which the federal government is involved. But John Marshall expanded his power to declare laws of Congress unconstitutional in a famous case, Marbury versus Madison.
The judicial review. Yes.
Yeah, that's right. So Marshall, but that was somewhat accidental. I don't think that Adams particularly could predict that, because he stayed on the court for 34 years, the longest serving Chief Justice, until 1835. He holds the record to this day for longevity. And he had a great deal of molding law to follow precedent. Whenever in doubt, follow precedent of the previous cases. In that sense, he was a conservative. Any other accomplishments of Adams himself?
Not that are coming to my mind right now.
Well,
I'm
I
sure
guess
there
I'll.
were some.
Yes, sure. He was the second president, and he was the vice president for George Washington, and became a Federalist, and served only one term, because he was in trouble from 1796 to 1800. And why was he disliked by the majority of the Federalists in his own party? Why he could not get reelected? Do you know anything about that?
The only, and I'm not going to hit on what you're looking for, but the only thing I really know of Adams, he wasn't very well liked by anyone. He was pretty much an elitist. And
well, he was an elitist, and he certainly had friends in Massachusetts, and he was certainly well educated. He was a graduate of Harvard, and he was a very good lawyer. And he had a real establishment in Massachusetts, and the reason why he got into trouble with most of the Federalists in Congress was that Adams, following Washington and Jefferson, wanted to preserve the peace, and a majority of the Federalists wanted to go to war against the French on the side of England in this long Napoleonic struggle. So there was a pressure on the part of Adams to, build the Navy, and he did establish the Navy Department. There was no Navy Department in the Washington administration. He only had 5 men in the cabinet: the Secretary of War, Secretary of State, the Attorney General, the Postmaster General. And Adams then did create a Navy which began to defend American merchant shipping on the high seas. Now the problem was, well, who do you go to war with, England or France, and why? Well, the Federalist Party, the majority of them, particularly a guy by the name of Pinckney from South Carolina, wanted to go to war against France, against revolution, and side with Great Britain and get involved in a European war. And Adams knew that the American Navy was in no shape to get involved with entangling alliances. So he always voted for peace. And anyway, Pinckney took all of his federal delegates and tried to defeat Adams for ever getting reelected. And the Pinckney-Adams fight for the second term led to Jefferson's getting elected, because Jefferson was pro-French and tilted against England. And then they passed the Alien Sedition Acts in 1798. Then I say they, the majority of the Federalist Party. I don't think Adams particularly wanted it, but he had to sign it in order to keep peace in the party. And the Alien Sedition Acts more or less censored the press. If you put any pro-French editorials in the paper, which Jefferson was putting in, you could be arrested for insulting the president, and then they were arresting aliens, Irish people who came to the United States, refugees from the French Revolution. So it was a very ethnically centered Anglo-Saxon pro-English party, and all other people need not apply. So anyway, when Jefferson got in there, back to freedom of the press and the Alien Sedition Acts were repealed, and people still quote that in the 20th century. It was a kind of a McCarthyist, Joe McCarthy type of thought control, okay? So anyway, that's why Jefferson was unpopular with his party. But in the long run, historians admire, John Adams. John Adams was a great intellect who had a poor reputation in the history books immediately after his defeat, but is now being rehabilitated by future historians and present historians and 20th century historians. Well, I think I've gone enough over the problem of the French Revolution and the British Anglo-French War and the merchant marine problem and the Department of the Navy. I guess we've hit all the major points. So anyway, in 1800, Thomas Jefferson won big. So let us raise the second question. What were the accomplishments of the Jefferson administration, who served 2 terms, 1800, re-elected in 1804?
I think Jefferson is the first of the Democratic Republicans, so I think he transfers, at least to the extent that it needs to be transferred. He's starting to put emphasis back on the rights of states,
yes,
versus
right,
the national government in general.
Right. And he popularized the word democracy, and we now talk about Jeffersonian democracy and Jacksonian democracy, 2 different interpretations of it. And he was suspicious of the banks in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. And Hamilton was his great rival, who said that government should be for the rich and the well-born. And of course, Jefferson was popular among the fans of the French Revolution, popular with the youth and the intellectuals, and the enemies of the Alien Sedition Act. And there was a growing democratic press that wanted free press. And Jefferson then supported the exports from Virginia on south, tobacco, cotton, timber, and rum and whiskey, and they imported slaves, so that the prosperity of the country went up during the Jefferson administration. And Jefferson himself had written the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, and he personally wanted to free the slaves, but he knew that the country, particularly the southern country, needed slaves for production. So he was a little bit of a hypocrite on that. He did not free his own slaves, and Washington, upon his retirement, freed his house slaves by good service, and they became free blacks. Jefferson spent all of his money on books, and he was the best educated man in the colonies. And he bought all of these works of philosophy, and he put the Lewis and Clark expedition to explore. Now, what did the Lewis and Clark expedition do?
Well, it basically maps the country as we know it, and even beyond. So you have the purchase of the Louisiana Territory.
And it was Jefferson who got that purchase.
Right.
1803, he goes to the French government, who was bankrupt because of war, and said, "I'd like to buy the port of New Orleans." Now, why did the United States need New Orleans?
Shipping, so you can move goods from the interior of the country down the Ohio River much easier than you can go over the Appalachians and out.
And Napoleon says, "Well, I'll sell you the whole territory, all the way out to the Rocky Mountains."
No, that's one of the more interesting things about Jefferson. He buys that when I think by definition he would have thought he would have argued that couldn't be done.
Well, he argued ahead of time that he was a strict constructionist. But when he had the opportunity, he expanded the opportunity and bought the land.
It was the right price.
And then he said, "Well, I changed my mind." And there was nobody in the court that would challenge him. Because everybody profited by that.
Sure. Well, and you know, I think that's one of the obviously, if you get beyond the fact that it what triples the size of the United States at the time.
Right.
Even if you get beyond that, it is what allows the country to grow.
Absolutely.
So not just in terms of space, but economically. So
that's right.
You know that interior now becomes an economic power as well as the coast.
Right. Now, Jefferson is also very important for Ohio. How did Ohio become a state? From the Ohio Territory. You see, the British left the Ohio Territory to the Washington administration.
It's part of the Northwest Ordinance.
Yeah, and that goes from the Pennsylvania line to the Mississippi River. And what Jefferson got was the land on the other side of the Mississippi all the way to the Rocky Mountains. So what about the Northwest Ordinance? What's the significance of the Northwest Ordinance?
Well, it's what spells out what you need, you know, what we need to do in order to become a state. So the significance of it is, I think, for me, is it encourages people to settle and apply for statehood, so it encourages that growth to the west.
All right, but Jefferson put his principle of no slavery in the Northwest Ordinance.
Correct.
Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Minnesota, Wisconsin. So, and then he wrote this freedom of religion. He regarded the freedom of religion for the state of Virginia as a greater accomplishment. His number one accomplishment was to disestablish the Episcopal Church in the state of Virginia and make it a free state in religion. So Jefferson was a deist. And that philosophy then extends across the country. And of course, he got the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights were largely Jefferson's inspiration. But the actual drafting, he was helped by one of Jefferson's lawyer friends, James Mason, actually wrote up most of the civil rights. And some of Jefferson's amendments didn't get in. He had a 12th Amendment called No Standing Army. That was turned down by the Congress. So Jefferson was a pacifist. He believed in freedom of the slaves, although he didn't get very far in a practical sense because most of the Southern planter class were against it. And then you want to say something about the French Revolution. The French government freed the slaves and stimulated the British government to free the slaves. And there was no trade of slaves on the Atlantic Ocean. And it was the French government that freed the slaves of its sugar colony in Haiti. And this was the first independent black independent republic in Latin America. And then, in a sense, they got their independence too quickly because Haiti has been a basket case ever since. The blacks who were freed had little education and could never really run the country. And even today, Bill Clinton is trying to bail the Haitians out of poverty. and disease and so on. But anyway, Jefferson in office was a mixture between idealism and practicality for his presidency. But he expanded the idea of the free states, and that would later come to a head in the American Civil War. I suppose we ought to review the status of the freedom of religion. Rhode Island and Vermont and Pennsylvania had freedom of religion before the American Revolution. Pennsylvania was a Quaker state, and Rhode Island was founded by Roger Williams, who was a refugee from Puritan, Massachusetts, and established in the Rhode Island Constitution freedom of religion. And they had no slavery in Rhode Island, Vermont, or Pennsylvania. So freedom of religion and freedom of slavery kind of went hand in hand. Now, New Hampshire technically had slavery, and so did Connecticut. But with the American Revolution, they passed laws called manumission. That is, if there was a landlord who had slaves, he could free them at his own cost, just as Washington did. And so there were only a few hundred slaves in New Hampshire and Connecticut. And the population, they were soon freed gradually from 1789, long before the Civil War. Now, New York and New Jersey also gradually became a free state, but there was more difficulty. New York had a substantial slave population in Manhattan to do all of the work and unloading the ships.
So dock workers.
Yeah. So New York had a manumission law, but the manumission was a little slow. So there were still slaves around in the 1830s. And New Jersey had the same kind of difficulty.
By this time, are they at least to the point where there's no replacement of slaves?
Oh, yeah, well, that was another law passed by the British and Americans by treaty, that there could be no importation of new black slaves after 1808. They gave it a 20-year pass. We got to make a time check here and interrupt. My guest here is Bill Salyer, and we're reviewing the early presidencies of Washington and Adams, and we're just about to wind up on Jefferson and the whole problem of freedom of religion and free slaves. Now, do you want to pick up where we are about that, or do you have a question for me?
No, that was, you answered it with I wasn't.
About this manumission.
Yes, I was not aware of slavery in New York and New Jersey.
Yeah, well, it was small, and in New Jersey, it was only in one county, Bergen County, on the other side of the Hudson River. But there was no need for slaves in Connecticut. And
it's not economical.
Not economically. There was no plantations there of any size. So gradually, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and New York, and New Jersey got rid of slavery, where it was slower in New York than any other of the northern states up to the Civil War. So Vermont came into the Union as the 14th state, and now Kentucky and Tennessee came into the Union in 1792 and 1796. Vermont joined in 1791. And those two states came in as slave states because they were largely settled from Virginia. And the Virginians took their slaves with them to Kentucky and Tennessee. So then the Ohio Territory, the 17th state, was another free state to keep up with the competition between the free states and the slave states. In leading down to the Civil War, they wanted to keep it more or less balanced in the Senate, you see. That's the importance of all of this. So I guess we're ready for the fourth president, James Madison. Unless you have any more comments about Jefferson.
No, I think you hit Jefferson pretty well. The most interesting parts of Jefferson to me are his commitment, basically, to education, both of himself and of other people.
That's right. He gave his private library to the Library of Congress when he died. He died bankrupt, and they had to sell his estate, Monticello, for debts. Mm. He had to sell his last days to
No speaking tours at that time.
Yeah, right. That's true. So that's the so-called reevaluation of Jefferson. Anyway, James Madison was a great constitutional lawyer and shared with Hamilton the making of the Constitution, clause by clause. And he helped Jefferson as Secretary of State in keeping out of war with France between 1800 and 1808. And he had a big farm and was a slaveholder himself. And he was trained by Jefferson in Jefferson's private law office. And Jefferson, just before he retired, passed a very unpopular law called the Embargo Act of 1808. He was going to go out of office anyway. But that was an embargo on the American exports and put the burden on American shipping not to export produce to the warring states in England and France.
Correct. That's a response to the British impressing sailors and the French seizing cargo and ships.
Right. So both the French and the British were seizing the ships, confiscating the cargo, and then the owners of the ship could get the ship back through a long court process, that they wouldn't do this contraband again. So there was a kind of an unspoken war between the United States as a neutral power with both England and France. And this was done kind of tactically day by day between Adams and Jefferson. And now Madison has the problem. And Madison was not a success as a president because he let the Democratic Congress kind of press him into war against England for commercial reasons and for land reasons. And
I think that's one of the enigmatic things about Madison. There's not really any indication that the French were no more, for lack of a better word, they weren't particularly trustworthy in the things that they said or did at the time in regards to that shipping.
No, each captain of the vessel decided to demand payment for whatever he captured.
But Madison also
it's just a question of getting caught.
Madison comes in into office at a very bad time too for him, because there's not a lot of way around.
Okay, so we're up to the War of 1812. Do you want to say how and why the War of 1812 broke out?
Well, why it did was we had basically Madison inherits the problem that we make money through trade,
right?
And so we absolutely need to ship. So you have pressure from people wanting to ship, and then you have pressure as well from people who are having either their people or their...
but this pressure came from certain states.
Well, the New England states, I would think, would, and probably
the New England states were opposed.
anything down, basically, I think, you know, when you have the South would be big because anytime you have huge plantations, you have a huge amount of goods that has to go out.
Right. They wanted to sell cotton in the South. That's true. And the war was declared on the 18th of June, 1812. And Madison was personally a little bit reluctant. And he was stampeded into this by his Democratic congressman. And there were certain states that wanted it. And the New England states, all 6 of them were opposed. New York was opposed because they could make plenty of money through smuggling and just taking their chances. And then there were some land-hungry people from Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, warhawks, who thought they could conquer Canada.
The foray into Canada.
So the official reason was freedom of the seas, which sounded very idealistic. But the unofficial reason was that Madison was convinced that the Southern militia could win against Canada and that the British would not send many troops because they were busy with Napoleon and it would be an easy mark. That turned out to be a bad gamble because the state militia were undisciplined and they got up there and they did not win any land battles in Canada. And the British had the Indians on their side. The Indians, Tecumseh and those people wanted British protection. So it was kind of ill thought out in a way. And the vote in Congress was 78 for war and 49 in the House of Representatives against war. Now in the Senate, the vote was a lot closer, 19-13. So Philadelphia, New York, Boston wanted to do business and were not worried about freedom of the seas and not worried about impressment. Anyway, the war didn't go too well militarily, and the timing was poor. Let's remind you, 18th of June, they declared war. On the 24th of June, Napoleon invades Russia. So you're going to have a much longer war. So the British then were allied to the Prussians, the Austrians, and the Spaniards, and they were technically losing to Napoleon, so it looked good for a while. But the British were ready for peace right away. So let's have negotiations. The United States Army only had 12,000 men. Now in 1814, at the end of the war, they had built it up to 35,000 in the regular army. Now the bankers in New York and in Boston and Philadelphia wouldn't loan these Southern warhawks any money for the militia. And the Hartford Convention met. You know anything about the Hartford Convention?
No, I'll misspeak if I
Well,
do.
Hartford is the capital of New England's Connecticut.
Connecticut, yes.
And all of these Federalists said, let's have a convention to discuss secession. And the Hartford Convention failed. They didn't secede because the war was coming to an end anyway. And they didn't get their act together until 1814, and negotiations were already going into. But it set a bad precedent for 1860, because the 10th Amendment was very vague. The 10th Amendment said that all powers not delegated in this Constitution
To the federal government, go to the
are reserved to the people and the states. Well, what are these powers? So the Hartford Convention and the South Carolina delegation, 1860, said, well, we have the right of secession. That's what that means. And Lincoln and the Federalists said, no, you don't have any right of secession. And of course, the 10th Amendment became a dead letter after the Civil War, because the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment essentially canceled the 10th Amendment and took that ambiguity out. It was up to interpretation of what these rights are and who would be the people and who would be the states that would interpret that. That was the problem with it. It didn't say the Supreme Court would have the final word.
Right.
Well, that became clearer after the Supreme Court got new powers as a result of the 14th Amendment. That's the key to that. Well, anyway, that's kind of projecting to the future. Anyway, John Quincy Adams saved the bacon of the Madison administration, because Madison then agreed to Adams, who was already on the ground in Europe.
Treaty of Ghent.
He had been a diplomat for Washington and Adams, and he had been a professional diplomat, and he was already the minister in the Netherlands. And he then advised Madison, well, let's have a truce pretty quickly, because you're not winning. And Madison then sent a three-man delegation. He sent John. Well, he appointed John Quincy Adams, even though he was a Federalist, and he appointed a Democrat by the name of Albert Gallatin, who was Jefferson's vice president and Secretary of Treasury. But he immediately resigned and said, I want the Supreme Court. I don't want to get involved in that. So he replaced Gallatin with Henry Clay and with Bayard. Bayard was the senator from Delaware. So he had two Democratic delegates, and one of those Democratic delegates, Henry Clay, was all in favor of getting peace, and Bayard went along. Anyway, the three of them finally signed the Peace of Ghent and got Madison out of the war. The talks began in August of 1814. They got down to serious negotiations in November, and the treaty was signed on the 24th of December, 1814. The British Parliament immediately ratified it, and Andrew Jackson, won a heroic battle, the Battle of New Orleans, in 1815, after the treaty was already signed. He defeated the British blockade at New Orleans, but it was a victory of prestige for General Jackson, but it wasn't really necessary. So John Quincy Adams was appointed as the new Secretary of State, and he became the greatest Secretary of State in the history of the United States. And he followed the diplomacy of Washington and the diplomacy of his father, John Adams. He was fluent in French, fluent in Dutch, could speak some German, taught Latin and Greek at Harvard University in languages. And Madison, in the end, appointed the best qualified man he could as his Secretary of State after that false start in June, in which he had the great faith in the Western militia. So anyway, Alexander I of Russia turned back Napoleon, and Napoleon's army was routed in 1813. And that sped up this peace process. And John Quincy Adams then made a quick peace and came back to the United States. And new states came in. Indiana came in 1816. Illinois came in 1918. Mississippi came in 1817. Alabama came in 1819. So we have the balance between the free states and the states, so that Madison turned his attention now to Western expansion, and everybody greeted the peace, and the country was reunited. Any other comments about Madison?
Well, like I said, I think Madison inherited some issues, and probably hadn't paid enough attention to the diplomacy that Washington and
Adams
arguably
and Madison and Jefferson,
and
even Monroe,
all may have used. And I think, well, and I look at Monroe more from the point of view that since he comes after, that maybe he has learned a good bit from.
Well, Monroe was a diplomat too,
Yes.
Madison just never had any experience in diplomacy because he was busy with the Constitution and being the governor of Virginia and getting the Virginia Jeffersonian Party elected, so to speak. He spent his time in Washington. And Monroe and Quincy Adams were in diplomacy from the very beginning. Well, anyway, to compare Madison with Washington and Adams and Jefferson, he failed to keep the peace, but he appointed, at the end, a clever man for his Secretary of State. And Adams was unpopular with the Federalist Congress. Madison was unpopular with the Democratic Congress. The energy for war comes from the press and Congress. I think that's the lesson of this for all administrations. And Jefferson was unpopular in Massachusetts and resisted the clamor for war. And Madison was unclear and didn't have the prestige to resist war because he didn't have enough diplomatic experience. So anyway, he came out strong in the end. And he recognized that the War of 1812 was and the whole country recognized the War of 1812 was a great mistake. It became the Second War of American Independence. It became the War of Independence for Canada, and everybody was satisfied when it was over. Well, I guess we're ready for the accomplishments of James Monroe, the fifth president. What do you think of him?
Well, I think Monroe's a very good president. I think he comes in a lot better time period than Madison. So, he has that going for him to begin with. The one I'm not entirely sold on, the Missouri Compromise takes place under Monroe, which I don't think really did much of anything other than delay the inevitable, which is the issue of slavery coming to a head. But the Monroe Doctrine, he certainly does a good job with Oregon Territory and negotiating a reasonable, which I think everyone was satisfied with, maybe even including the British.
Right.
So that's known as the era of good feelings. So
that's right.
We're not fighting. We're not arguing. Right. Prosperity is.
In 1820, Monroe was elected by the Electoral College with 80% of the electors. The Federalist Party had fallen apart. And John Quincy Adams changed his party, and he founded, along with Henry Clay, the National Republican Party. The idea was to expand in the West and forget about the slavery question. It'll heal itself in time. That was their great hope. Now, Monroe was a little bit more conservative than the four deists who had preceded him. He was a loyal Episcopalian, which is a kind of a liberal religion, but he didn't go into deist philosophy, which was the philosophy of the first four presidents. The problem with deist philosophy is that the average American couldn't understand philosophy. And religion is popular among the Congress and the newspaper readers, so that Monroe became more popular by just becoming a loyal, nominal, liberal Episcopalian and not getting into philosophy. Monroe came from the planter class in Northern Virginia. He was a veteran of the American Revolution, and in 1778 he was only 18 years old, and he volunteered for George Washington's army, and he fought in the Battle of Trenton.
Crossed the Delaware with Washington.
He did?
Yes, he was.
Okay.
That was one of the interesting bits that I don't know exactly how. We always see the picture of Washington in the one boat.
Yeah.
There obviously were more, but supposedly, to my understanding, he was in that group that crossed
Well, that's
the
interesting.
Delaware.
I didn't know that. Anyway, he studied law with Thomas Jefferson, and he was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention in 1776, which ruled the country before the American Constitution was drafted, and George Washington was appointed by the Continental Congress to be the commander-in-chief of a volunteer army. And George Washington's great talent was to unite the 13 colonies for that cause to get independence. So then Monroe kept serving the various presidents as a diplomat, and he went back to Virginia as governor of Virginia, and he had diplomatic experience for Thomas Jefferson, because when Thomas Jefferson negotiated the deal to buy the Louisiana Territory, Monroe went to Paris and worked on the financial details. And then during the War of 1812, Monroe advised Madison, both as Secretary of War and as Secretary of State, well, you're not winning, and you better negotiate quickly. So he was on the side of peace, but being the junior man, he had to be a little soft on that. And Monroe himself had to rotate those offices between Secretary of War and Secretary of State, because they didn't stay there very long, because they knew they were not going to get any prestige in a losing thing. So anyway, they failed to conquer Canada, and Monroe then appointed John Quincy Adams as his Secretary of State as a reward for the Peace of Ghent. And well, let's talk about the population of the country. This is part of this success of Monroe in getting good times. In 1790, the first census, Virginia was the largest state with 748,000 people. And then in 1800 and 1810, it had grown from 748,000 to, by 1810, to 975,000. Now, back in 1790, Pennsylvania was the second state with 434,000. Massachusetts, 379,000. And New York was fourth with 340,000. And then by 1810, New York was growing fast and was up to 900,000. And Delaware in 1790 was the least populated state with 59,000. Well, we're going to have to stop at this point. We only got a couple of minutes for summary. And we'll have to have another session to finish up Monroe's success. Would you like to summarize what we've accomplished today?
Well, I think we've gone back and reset the table, so to speak, of the first four presidents and leaning into the fifth.
Right.
Just talking about some of the things that each one of them had to face,
right.
And how that can affect your decision making at that point in time, how that can affect what as you put it best, with your legacy, so to speak.
Right.
I think Adams is probably a good example of that, someone not particularly popular in his own time, but over time has become much more so.
That's right. The historians reevaluate the evidence. They rewrite history.
And it is interesting just because of the fact that, you know, there are a lot of things that I think people tend to oversimplify, and there are a lot of things that you don't, if you don't stop and look at it piece by piece, then it is easy to oversimplify as to
Right.
looking at and attempting
Right.
to understand the whole perspective.
Right. Right. Well, my conclusion is that Madison was a failure to stop the Democratic pressure for war, and he appointed John Quincy Adams to get him out of the situation. And Madison served 2 terms, 1816 to 1820. He deserved to be reelected by getting to the era of good feelings. And Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams reunite the country. And we need to have this debate among the historians and the politicians. And thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Democracy is sustained by debate.